So if someone makes a short list of Sri Lanka's leading English poets of the 1980s, Richard de Zoysa will definitely make the top of that list. By top, I don't mean number one, but somewhere among the top two or three. A couple of other names that comes to mind includes Jean Arasanayagam and Anne Ranasinghe, probably the two most widely read and most widely circulated Sri Lankan writers internationally and locally. But it's also up to speculation as to what Richard would have produced was he allowed to live beyond the 19th of February 1990. This is the day he was abducted from his Valikadavatta home, and the next thing you know is that his bullet drilled body was found in the along the Moratua beach strip. So Richard was only 32 when he died, and already a kind of a vibrant presence, a multi-talented, multi-layered personality at once and at the same time a broadcaster, an actor, thespian, out there in television, in film, a human rights activist, a journalist, and also maybe it's this breadth and the depth that he probably brought to his work that made him embroiled in the extremely treacherous conditions the country was going through at the time. So it's 1988, 89, and 90, the time we generally call the Dhavala Bhishane or the Bhishane, with the second JVP rebellion dominating the day-to-day discourses, and that it was definitely not a tea party between the government and the rebels. In fact, de Soisa's killing, in one theory, is attributed to a rebel connection that he had fostered, of him being a part of the JVP in some way. I remember with two of my friends, uh, I was involved in the publication of a small booklet in the occasion of Richard de Soysa's 25th death anniversary. And this booklet actually uh, drew one review from a guy writing to the island at the time, someone who also is alleged to have been quite closely involved in anti-JVP paramilitary activism in the late 1980s. In that review, he actually took a pot shot at myself and my two friends, calling us promoters of terrorism by writing a booklet. It's not even a book, it's a small booklet on Richard de Soysa. Uh, de Soysa comes from a very, very well-connected elite background, St. Thomas's educated, uh, introduced into the fine arts at a very young age. So it kind of denotes a certain kind of silver spoon born background and upbringing. Incidentally, de Soysa was the best actor of the inaugural Interschool Shakespeare competition in 1973, and he's one of the few guys to have bagged this prize twice because he won it again in 1975. And in fact, he has made it to the school senior drama outfit, senior drama team at a very young age, and largely also due to him being spotted as a theatre talent by Rajiva Vijay Singh, who then became Richard's lifelong friend. And in many ways, I would say the preservation of Richard's poetry, at least in one single volume, is largely in debt to the good work done by Rajiva after Richard's death, because Rajiva was instrumental, I think, in getting Richard's poetry bound together as a Sabaragamu University publication in the late 1990s, unless it's 2000. I remember it as 1998, It could be 2000, one of those 2 years, but in the late 90s going into the 2000s. In fact, it's very unfortunate that someone like Lakdas Wickramasinghe didn't have a Rajiva Vijayasinghe in his life to get his poetry preserved. Would have done a whole lot of difference to the Sri Lankan Academy today, where it is right now. So, if you take Richard's writing per se, what really detains my interest and attention is the political energy that he channels through the corpus of his poetry, late 70s to the late 1980s. But to be fair by Richard, his writing spreads across a very broad array, including several very intelligent engagements with society, issues of class and identity, as well as a largely neglected department of love poetry, very powerful expressions of intimate and romantic feelings. But for the purpose of this engagement, this interaction, I think I will have to restrict myself to a very brief, almost a fleeting overview of some of the political poetry, because this poetry is also very important, because he writes this poetry and channels it as a criticism against a government that was emerging as an authoritarian dictatorship across the 1980s. So this is J.R. Jayawardena's UNP government, which was a self-styled dictatorship with a constitutional veil. What else can you call a regime where the ruler stands up and says, look, with the kind of power I have right now, the only thing I can't do is turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. He comes into power in 1977, Jayawardena. It's like a landslide victory. His conventional opposition, the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, is completely voted out. In fact, in the parliament that comes into being afterwards, the SLFP doesn't even get the seat the SLFP leader doesn't even get the seat of the leader of the opposition. This is Sirima Bandaranayake. And actually, Jayawardena sets in place in 1978 the constitution which we are still struggling with. And between 78 and, during Richard's lifetime, the next 10 years or so, this constitution is amended at least 9 times. So I think Richard very early identifies the threat this constitution as well as the political program of Jayawardena's UNP poses both the country in terms of the democracy as well as its stability. So there are poems like Gajaga Vannama, which comes pretty early on. Gajaga Vannama is about an incident where there are some elephants running riot. Some elephants have cut loose and they are running riot on the streets. Now, apparently this was based on a real incident following the Nawam Perahara, where some elephants had cut loose. But he kind of imports that idea and frames it within a poem to table a fairly powerful political critique at the time. And then there are other poems on the back of Gajaga Vannama, like Colombo 1981. The poem starts with an apology to William Wordsworth, because we quite soon realize the poem is modeled after Wordsworth's famous poem London 1802. In London 1802, Wordsworth is calling on the spirit of Milton. Milton, who is known for his righteousness, to return to England because England has a need of him. That's how the poem starts. Milton, thou should be writing now because the country has a need of him. In Richard's poem, Richard calls on none other than Tazi Vittachi, a very famous journalist, powerful editorial pen, where Tazi Vittachi in the 1950s and 60s, his columns were much looked forward to in the weekend papers in which he used to quite artistically and with a sense of humor critique some of the foibles of the ruling elite. And Richard actually notes that this is what is missing in Sri Lanka right now, because in the early 1980s, the kind of journalistic spaces where people like Vitachi worked, the lake house, it had been nationalized through regulation in the 70s. And politicization was growing and rampant. And at least in de Zoysa's assessment, there seems to be a lack of tolerance to criticism. So these are the kind of early years of politicians unleashing their thugs in order to land on people who channel criticism and dissent. Then there are poems like Broken Promise, very playful. It's written as a tune, and there is a stage direction that it has to be sung to the air of Danno Budunge. It's an exposing of the curse that has descended on the island, because he kind of sets apart the election promises given by the Javardhana government pre-election to what the actual ground condition is a few years after the election. So it's again very playful. So if you take Gajaga Vannama, Broken Promise, Colombo 1981, at one level it shows the range of de Zoysa's imagination. It's very creative. It's not only, you see, garden type poetry in the guise of criticism, but he also kind of dramatizes it, brings in other elements. There's an inherent playfulness about it. But this doesn't necessarily prevent him from being deeply critical of what he sees. The best example is Animal Crackers, a poem dated 25th July 1983, a poem which actually overlooks on Black July violence breaking out on the streets. The poem is addressed to Dimitri, to be read when he's old enough to understand. So it's like a fairly prophetic statement that there's enough time to kind of read this, because this is a spiral that's going to send Sri Lankan society down an abyss for many years to come. So there is that kind of line. But also a couple of other poems I want to just cite in passing. Lepidoptera and Talking of Michelangelo, two poems which are very sensitive to very sensitive readings of class. Talking of Michelangelo, of course, it's a critique of the very class and social fabric to which he belongs, the Colombo middle class. It's almost written as a straightforward piece of satire. Whereas Lepidoptera, it's a bit more sensitive and multi-layered. Once again, the class inequality of society is brought out, but also how the dominant class holds on to its position at the expense of the emerging classes, the social margins, to whom there is a promise to prosper, to whom there is a promise to move ahead. But at one point, they can't move beyond a particular point. Every time I read Lepidoptera, because I had my education in what you call a national school, it was a fairly privileged space in terms of education acquisition. Every time I read Lepidoptera, what comes to my mind are people coming to this school, this big institute, from various small schools after the scholarship exam. And these are things you never think about at that time. The kind of dislocation that results in their lives, the kind of rupture that they experience at that age of 10 running on 11. And where their lives go from that point onwards. Surely these are some of the most brilliant minds of that batch that year, and definitely most of them live on to fulfill the promise to graduate into the advanced level class and to university beyond, and to become champions and leaders of their respective fields. But I'm wondering whether there is some part, a kind of an innocence that De Zoysa hints at in Lepidoptera, that gets lost on the way. An innocence, like what he mentions in the poem, like a butterfly dying little by little and completely wasting away, which we cannot redeem, no matter what kind of material or professional success these people actually achieve in later life. So that's Lepidoptera, one of my favorite poems all time in all languages, mind you. So that is Richard de Zoysa, but just a couple of remarks, because Richard de Zoysa is also, as I mentioned right at the beginning, a certain kind of fetish, because he was an enigma and he has left behind that enigma and a sense of futility with his death. And as a result, he is a name that gets referenced in whatever literary, sociological, or political commentaries that often draw on the Bhishana Samaya, the late 1980s. There are several important references other than Rajiva Vijay Singha's Limits of Love that I have come across, and several memorable ways in which Richard has been referenced, more than something being extravagant of the reference itself. The way he has been referenced, quite memorable. One is Prince Gunasekara's. It's a hefty book. It's called A Lost Generation, Sri Lanka in Crisis, The Untold Story. It has three titles, that book. Prince Gunasekara wrote this book in exile in London between 1990 and 1995. It was finally published in 1998. This is Prince Gunasekara's commentary of what happened in Sri Lanka from 1977 onwards, that led to the impasse in 1988 and 89. Now, in this book, there are several references to Richard's death, rich with behind the curtains happenings to which Prince Gunasekara is privy. So, for example, Prince quotes an exchange, a conversation he had with Ranjan Vijayaratne, Minister of Defense at the time, who had been in the company, Ranjan, who had been in the company of the guy who apparently led the squad that went to kidnap Richard de Zoysa on the eve of the kidnapping. So the guy who is alleged to have led this kidnapping is SSP, Senior Superintendent of Police, Ronnie Gunasinghe, very close and loyal watchdog of the Premadasa government at the time. In fact, Ronnie Gunasinghe himself lost his life in the bomb that took Premadasa's life in 1993, 1st of May 1993. But incidentally, according to Prince Gunasekara, Ronnie Gunasinghe has been in the company of Ranjan Vijayaratne before leaving on that mission to kidnap Richard de Zoysa. So this is in Prince Gunasekara's A Lost Generation. The second reference is actually Janaka Mallimarachchi. He's a journalist, he's a broadcaster. Unless I'm mistaken, he's still, probably by now, he's a big figure in the television, Rupavahini, in the Rupavahini Broadcasting Corporation. Janaka Mallimarachchi wrote a book a couple of years ago called Ratu Anguru. It's a kind of a biography / novel, Ratu Anguru, in which he kind of reminisces the days he used to meet Richard de Zoysa in the Rupavahini Broadcasting Corporation premises. This is once again the height of terror, 1989. And of course, Janaka Malli Maharaj has political connections. He comes from a political family. The former UNP minister Veerasinghe Malli Maharaj is Janaka's father. His brother Jayantha Malli Maharaj was a politician at the local government level. He was killed, I think, by the JVP. So there's this memorable reference where Janaka remembers Richard coming up to him and saying that, Janaka, this has to stop. Somehow we have to stop these meaningless deaths of so many youth. Why can't you speak to your father and do something about it? Words to that effect. And Janaka notes that a few weeks later, Richard himself was killed. So I think that terminates our discussion on Richard de Zoysa.